Have you ever reached a point in your life where nothing felt right anymore? The dreams that once excited you suddenly feel empty. The people you once depended on no longer understand you. The future that once seemed so clear has become impossible to imagine. You wake up each morning carrying a strange weight that has no name. You tell yourself you're simply exhausted. Maybe you're losing motivation. Maybe you've made the wrong choices. But no matter how hard you try to return to the person you used to be, something inside refuses to go back. What if that feeling isn't a sign that you're failing? What if it's the first sign that your life is preparing to change in ways you cannot yet see? Stay with me until the very end, because there is one truth about feeling lost that almost nobody understands. And once you see it, you'll never fear uncertainty in quite the same way again. From childhood, we're taught to believe that life should move in a straight line. Study hard, find the right career, build the perfect relationships, follow a predictable path, and everything will eventually make sense. We grow up believing that certainty is the reward for making good decisions, yet real life rarely follows straight lines. Sometimes, the more you grow, the less certain you become, not because you've lost your direction, because the old direction no longer belongs to you. Imagine walking through a dense forest with a map you've trusted for years. Every turn has always matched the path ahead. Then one day, the landscape changes. Rivers shift, trees fall, new paths appear while familiar ones disappear. Suddenly, the map is no longer useful. Would you blame yourself, or would you realize the world around you has changed? The same thing happens within the human mind. There comes a moment when the inner landscape begins transforming faster than the identity you've built to navigate it. The beliefs that once guided you no longer provide answers. The goals that once motivated you begin losing their power. The life you've carefully constructed starts feeling strangely unfamiliar. Most people panic at this stage. They assume something is wrong. They search desperately for ways to become their old selves again. But what if the old self isn't meant to return? One of the greatest misunderstandings about transformation is believing it feels inspiring from the beginning. In reality, transformation often begins as confusion. Before a new chapter is written, the previous one slowly dissolves. Yet we are rarely taught how to live inside that space between endings and beginnings. We are comfortable celebrating success. We rarely celebrate uncertainty. Yet uncertainty is where every meaningful transformation quietly begins. Think back to every major turning point in your life. Before you found clarity, wasn't there confusion? Before confidence, wasn't there doubt? Before strength, wasn't there struggle? Every significant change you've ever experienced was preceded by a season where nothing made complete sense, yet each time you survived. Each time, life carried you further than you imagined possible. Still, when uncertainty returns, we forget. We convince ourselves this time is different. This time we're truly lost. Perhaps we are not. Perhaps we are simply standing at the edge of an identity that can no longer contain the person we are becoming. There is something remarkable about the human mind. It becomes attached not only to people, but also to identities. You don't simply become a teacher, an engineer, an artist, a parent, or a successful professional. You become someone who believes, this is who I am. The identity begins feeling permanent, but life never promised permanence. Sometimes the greatest obstacle to your future is not failure. It is the success that convinced you to stop growing. Sometimes the greatest prison is not suffering. It is familiarity, because familiarity whispers a dangerous lie. It says, stay here, at least you know what to expect. Growth whispers something very different. It says, you cannot become who you are meant to be while clinging to who you used to be. That is why feeling lost can be so painful. It is not only your future that feels uncertain, your identity begins dissolving. The person you thought you were no longer feels complete. Imagine a snake trying to hold onto its old skin. The very thing that once protected it eventually becomes too small. If it refuses to shed that skin, it cannot continue growing. The old skin was never the enemy. It simply reached the end of its purpose. Perhaps the same is true for certain versions of yourself. The version that constantly sought approval. The version that believed achievement alone would create happiness. The version that ignored exhaustion because slowing down felt like failure. The version that remained silent to avoid disappointing others. These identities may have helped you survive, but survival is not the same as living. Life has a quiet way of removing identities that no longer reflect your deepest truth, and when it does, the experience feels strangely empty. People often describe this period by saying, I don't even know who I am anymore. Those words sound frightening, yet they may be the beginning of the most honest chapter of your life. Because only after you stop pretending to know exactly who you are do you become curious enough to discover who you could become. There is another reason people feel lost before life changes. They mistake silence for absence. Have you ever noticed that the loudest periods of life often leave very little room for self-reflection? Constant work, constant conversations, constant entertainment, constant distraction. The mind becomes so occupied reacting to the outside world that it rarely listens to what is quietly happening within. Then suddenly, everything becomes quieter. A relationship ends, a career changes, friends drift away, plans collapse. At first, the silence feels unbearable. Then something unexpected happens. You begin hearing thoughts that were always there. Questions you've ignored for years begin returning. What truly matters to me? What kind of life feels meaningful? Whose expectations have I been trying to satisfy? If no one judged me, what would I actually choose? These are dangerous questions, not because they harm you, because they change you. The answers often require leaving behind lives that looked successful from the outside, but felt empty on the inside. This is why genuine transformation rarely begins with certainty. It begins with honesty, and honesty often arrives disguised as discomfort. Many people spend years trying to escape discomfort. They distract themselves, they stay busy, they fill every empty moment with noise, anything to avoid facing uncertainty. Yet avoided uncertainty never disappears, it simply waits. Life is astonishingly patient. The lessons we postpone quietly return through different circumstances until we are finally willing to listen. Maybe that recurring feeling of being lost is not punishment. Maybe it is an invitation. An invitation to stop living automatically. An invitation to question beliefs you never consciously chose. An invitation to build a life that reflects your authentic values instead of inherited expectations. The greatest danger is not feeling lost. The greatest danger is refusing to explore why, because a person who never questions their path may spend decades walking in the wrong direction. A person who pauses, reflects, and feels uncertain may appear slower, yet they often arrive somewhere far more meaningful. There comes a moment when you realize that certainty is overrated. It creates comfort, but curiosity creates growth. The people who transform their lives are rarely the ones who always knew exactly where they were going. They are the ones who had the courage to continue walking, even when the road disappeared beneath their feet. Perhaps that is what life has been asking of you all along. Not immediate answers, not perfect plans, simply the courage to remain present while your old life quietly makes room for something greater. Because what feels like emptiness today may actually be space. Space where a new identity is beginning to take shape. Space where forgotten dreams can finally breathe. Space where the person you've spent years trying to become no longer depends on the approval of others, but on the quiet certainty growing within yourself. And perhaps the greatest mistake we make is believing that being lost means we are moving away from our purpose. Sometimes, being lost is the only path that can lead us there. Perhaps one day you'll look back on this season of your life, the sleepless nights, the unanswered questions, the uncertainty that seemed to follow you everywhere, and you'll realize it was never proof that you were falling behind. It was proof that you had finally stopped living a life that no longer belonged to you. The truth is, no meaningful transformation begins with complete certainty. A seed must disappear beneath the soil before anyone sees the tree. The night is always darkest before the horizon begins to brighten. And every chapter of genuine growth asks you to release an old identity before revealing the new one. So if you feel lost today, don't rush to escape the feeling. Sit with it, listen to it. Because beneath the confusion may be the quiet voice you've ignored for years. The voice that has been patiently waiting for the world to become silent enough to finally be heard. The version of you that once needed constant approval may be coming to an end. The version that lived according to fear may be slowly losing its grip. The version that settled for a life that felt safe but empty may finally be ready to let go. That is why this season feels so unfamiliar. You are not standing at the end of your story. You are standing in the space where your old story can no longer continue, and a new one has not yet been written. Trust that space, not because it is comfortable, but because it is honest. One day, what feels like confusion will become clarity. What feels like loss will become freedom, and what feels like being lost today may become the very moment you discover the life that was waiting for you all along. So keep walking even when the path is hidden, even when the future refuses to explain itself. Because the greatest changes in life rarely announce their arrival. They begin quietly, with the courage to take one more step while everything inside you whispers that nothing makes sense. And then, almost without realizing it, you'll look back and understand that you were never truly lost. You were simply becoming someone your old life could no longer contain.